when the criminal is faster than the police. The city buzzed with restless energy, its neon lights flickering like nervous fireflies. Rain dripped from rooftops, pooling into glistening puddles on the cracked pavement. Detective Ray Foster gripped his radio tightly, the static crackling like a sinister whisper in his ear. "Suspect heading north 5th Avenue. The dispatcher's voice broke through. Ray adjusted his trench coat, his boots splashing through the cold water as he ran. The sound of his breathing echoed in the damp alleyways, sharp and shallow. Ahead, a shadow darted between streetlights, moving like smoke in the wind. The man was fast, too fast. Ray's legs burned, but he pushed harder, his mind locked on the figure disappearing into the labyrinth of the city. The suspect turned into a narrow alley, the kind where streetlights dared not intrude. Ray hesitated for a fraction of a second, his instincts screaming. But he followed. The smell of decay and damp brick hit him like a wall, sharp and sour. Somewhere, a cat hissed, its eyes glowing like twin orbs in the dark. The suspect's footsteps were no longer a rhythm, but a frantic scramble. Ray's pulse quickened, he was gaining. Suddenly, silence. Ray froze, the alley stretching ahead like a black void. His eyes scanned the shadows, but they seemed to shift and breathe. Then, a sound, a faint metallic scrape behind him. He spun around, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. Nothing. The radio on his hip crackled again. Backup's 2 minutes out. 2 minutes felt like an eternity. A chill ran down his spine, the air thick with something unspoken, unseen. And then, from the shadows, the criminal emerged. He wasn't running anymore. He stood still, a smirk carved into his face like a scar. "You're slower than I thought," he said, his voice like gravel dragged across steel. Ray reached for his gun, but the man was faster. A glint of metal flashed in the dim light, a knife, impossibly close. The world spun as Ray hit the ground, his breath stolen by the impact. The man's laughter echoed through the alley, sharp and mocking. By the time Ray scrambled to his feet, clutching his side, the shadows had swallowed the criminal whole. The distant wail of sirens approached, too late. Ray stood there, trembling, the realization sinking in. The criminal wasn't just faster than the police. He was always one step ahead, and in the silent, empty alley, Ray couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just become the prey. Ray's fingers trembled as he pressed the radio to his lips. "Suspect escaped," he muttered, his voice cracking. "Send medics. He's armed." The dispatcher's reply came, steady but distant, as if muffled by the weight of failure. Ray leaned against the cold brick wall, his breath visible in the damp night air. The pain in his side sharpened with every inhale, a cruel reminder of how close it had been. He scanned the alley again, but it was lifeless now, just shadows and silence. The sirens grew louder, bouncing off the walls like desperate cries. And yet, the weight of solitude pressed down on him, heavier than ever. A faint shuffle caught his attention, a flicker of motion in his peripheral vision. He snapped his head to the side, drawing his gun with practiced precision. But there was nothing there, just a crumpled soda can rolling lazily in the wind. Paranoia set in, coiling around his mind like a venomous snake. Was the criminal watching him even now? The thought sent a chill crawling up his spine, colder than the night air. "Detective Foster!" The shout pulled him from his thoughts as a patrol car screeched to a halt at the alley's entrance. 2 officers rushed toward him, their faces a mix of concern and urgency. Ray straightened up, forcing the ache in his body to the back of his mind. "He's gone," he said bitterly, holstering his weapon. "Northbound, on foot. He's fast." One of the officers nodded and darted back to the car, calling for a perimeter sweep. The other stayed, eyeing Ray's wound. "You're bleeding," she said, reaching for her radio. "We need medics here now." Ray shook his head, brushing her off. "It's just a scratch." But the tremor in his voice betrayed him. She hesitated before stepping back, her gaze lingering on him. The scene was quiet now, eerily so. Even the rain seemed to have paused, holding its breath. Ray's mind replayed the encounter, every detail etched into his memory. The way the criminal moved, like he knew every corner, every shadow. The way he smiled, as if mocking the very idea of being caught. "Who is this guy?" Ray muttered under his breath. The officer beside him looked puzzled. "You don't know?" Ray glanced at her, a knot tightening in his chest. "He's been running circles around us for months," she continued, her voice low. "Some say he's ex-military. Others think he's just gifted." Ray frowned, his hand instinctively brushing against the sore spot on his side. "Gifted," he repeated, the word leaving a bitter taste. A radio crackled nearby. No sign of the suspect. "He's disappeared again." Ray clenched his fists, frustration boiling under his skin. This wasn't just a chase anymore. It was a game, and Ray wasn't sure if he was the hunter or the hunted. Ray stared down the alley, his mind racing with unanswered questions. The game wasn't fair. Every move the criminal made seemed calculated, deliberate, as if he'd orchestrated the chase from the beginning. "Detective," the officer's voice broke his thoughts. "Do you want to head back to the precinct?" Ray shook his head, the fire in his eyes refusing to dim. "I'm not letting him win," he said, more to himself than to her. The officer hesitated, then nodded. "We'll keep sweeping. Let's regroup when we have something." She turned and jogged toward the patrol car, leaving Ray alone once more. He let out a heavy breath, his heart still pounding against his ribs. The rain started again, softly at first, before escalating into a steady downpour. Ray pulled his collar tighter and began to walk, retracing his steps down the alley. The smell of wet asphalt and decay hung heavy in the air, but something else lingered, a faint trace of cologne. Ray stopped, his eyes narrowing. It wasn't his. He crouched low, scanning the ground, and there it was, a single cigarette, but still warm to the touch. He picked it up carefully, examining the brand. Not a common one. A faint grin tugged at the corners of his lips. "Gotcha," he whispered. This wasn't over. If the criminal thought he could vanish, he'd underestimated Ray's resolve. The precinct's tech team could trace the cigarette's purchase, narrow down locations. It wasn't much, but it was something. As Ray stood, he caught a flash of movement in the reflection of a puddle. His blood ran cold. Spinning around, he aimed his flashlight into the shadows. Nothing. The rain poured harder, blurring his vision and drowning out faint sounds. But he knew what he saw, or thought he saw. The criminal was toying with him, staying close, watching. Ray clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the flashlight. "Enjoy it while you can," he muttered under his breath. "Because when I catch you, there won't be anywhere left to run." Somewhere in the city's endless maze, the criminal smiled. The chase was his domain, his masterpiece. And tonight, he'd won. But he also knew Detective Ray Foster was different. Persistent. Obsessed. The next time their paths crossed, it wouldn't just be a chase. It would be war. The rain slowed to a drizzle as Ray made his way back to his car. Each step felt heavier, his body aching from the night's ordeal. Sliding into the driver's seat, he tossed the cigarette but onto the passenger side, staring at it like it held all the answers. The soft hum of the engine filled the silence as he started the car, but his mind was miles away. This wasn't just about catching a criminal anymore. It was personal. Ray tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, his eyes darting between the road and his rearview mirror. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every silhouette looked like the man who had escaped. Back at the precinct, the team was waiting, their faces a mix of curiosity and exhaustion. "Did you see him?" one officer asked. Ray nodded grimly. "More than that, I was inches from him." A murmur spread through the room. "He's fast," Ray continued, pacing now. "But he's not invincible. He left this behind." He held up the cigarette, but it's soggy and barely holding together. "Get it tested. Prints, DNA, whatever you can pull from it." The tech team scrambled into action, their energy renewed by the faint hope of a lead. As they worked, Ray sank into his chair, rubbing his temples. His mind replayed the smirk, the knife, the taunting words. The criminal wasn't just confident, he was arrogant. And that arrogance would be his downfall. Hours passed, the precinct settling into a tense quiet. Then, a voice cut through the stillness. "Detective Foster, we've got something." Ray shot up from his seat, crossing the room in quick strides. The technician held up a report, her expression a mix of triumph and concern. Partial prints, but enough to get a match. She hesitated before continuing. The name's Marcus Kane, ex-military, dishonorably discharged, specializes in tactical evasion. Ray's stomach tightened. The name was familiar. He'd seen it on an old case file, a cold case involving a string of robberies, each executed with surgical precision. Marcus Kane, Ray repeated, the words heavy on his tongue. Why now? Why come back after all this time? The technician shrugged. Maybe he likes the chase. Or maybe it's you he's after. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling like a storm cloud. Ray clenched his fists, the pieces falling into place. Kane wasn't running away. He was leading Ray into something bigger. Ray grabbed his coat, his determination renewed. Where's his last known address? He demanded. The technician rattled off an address on the outskirts of the city. A quiet, abandoned warehouse district. Of course. Ray stepped into the night, the rain picking up again as if to warn him. This time he wasn't chasing shadows. He was walking straight into the lion's den, and Marcus Kane would be waiting. The drive to the warehouse district was eerily quiet. Rain streaked down the windshield, the rhythmic tapping matching the pounding of Ray's heart. Streetlights grew sparse, their dim glow swallowed by the encroaching darkness. Ray's headlights sliced through the gloom, revealing crumbling buildings and overgrown weeds. The address loomed ahead, a derelict warehouse with shattered windows and rusted metal doors. He parked a block away, cutting the engine. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant howl of the wind. Ray reached for his weapon, checking the magazine with practiced precision. This wasn't going to be another chase. He wasn't going to let Kane slip through his fingers again. Approaching the warehouse, Ray's boots crunched on broken glass, each step echoing in the empty night. The air felt heavier here, thick with the scent of oil and mildew. He reached the door and paused, his hand hovering over the handle. Every instinct screamed danger, but he pushed forward, easing the door open with a low creak. Inside, the darkness swallowed him whole. He clicked on his flashlight, its beam cutting through the shadows to reveal a maze of crates and machinery. Each creak of the floorboards, each rustle in the air, set his nerves on edge. Kane, Ray called out, his voice steady but low. The sound echoed, mocking him with its emptiness. He moved deeper into the warehouse, his flashlight scanning every corner. Suddenly, a clang rang out from somewhere above. Ray snapped his head up, his flashlight catching a fleeting shadow on the catwalk. Kane, he shouted, his voice slicing through the stillness. A low, chilling laugh echoed back. Welcome, detective. Kane's voice rang out, smooth and taunting. Ray turned in circles, his flashlight darting across the rafters. You're persistent. I'll give you that, Kane continued, his voice coming from everywhere and nowhere. But you're out of your depth. Ray's grip tightened on his weapon. You're done, Kane. There's no way out this time. Another laugh, colder now. That's where you're wrong. Suddenly, the lights flickered on, blinding Ray for a moment. When his vision adjusted, he saw Kane standing on the catwalk above, his arms spread wide. Welcome to my playground, Kane said with a grin. Before Ray could respond, Kane disappeared into the shadows, his footsteps echoing across the metal beams. Ray cursed under his breath, sprinting toward the stairs. As he climbed, his pulse thundered in his ears. The higher he went, the more exposed he felt, the catwalk creaking beneath his weight. Reaching the top, he found himself in a maze of narrow walkways, the drop below dizzying. Then a voice from behind. You really should have stayed away. Ray spun, but it was too late. A heavy blow struck his shoulder, sending him sprawling onto the metal grating. His flashlight clattered to the ground, its beams spinning wildly. Kane loomed over him, his figure silhouetted against the dim warehouse light. You don't get it, do you? Kane sneered, his knife glinting in his hand. This isn't about escaping. This is about showing you how powerless you are. Ray gritted his teeth, his hand fumbling for his gun. But Kane was faster, kicking it out of reach. The knife came down, and Ray rolled to the side just in time. The blade scraped against the metal, sending sparks flying. Ray lunged forward, slamming into Kane with all his strength. The two men grappled, their fight a blur of fists and fury. The catwalk swayed beneath them, groaning under the weight of their struggle. Kane's strength was almost inhuman, every move calculated and precise. But Ray fought with sheer determination, refusing to give up. With a desperate shove, he sent Kane staggering backward, his foot slipping on the edge. For a moment, Kane teetered, his eyes wide with shock. Then, with a final scream, he fell, his body disappearing into the darkness below. Ray collapsed against the railing, his chest heaving. The warehouse was silent once more, save for the distant hum of the city. He peered over the edge, but the shadows swallowed everything. There was no sign of Kane, just the echo of his laugh, lingering in the still air. Ray staggered down the stairs, every muscle screaming in protest. As he stepped outside, the rain washed over him, cold and unrelenting. The game was over. For now. But as Ray stared back at the warehouse, he couldn't shake the feeling. Kane wasn't gone. Not yet. And when he returned, Ray would be waiting. Ray leaned against his car, letting the rain soak through his clothes as his breathing steadied. The warehouse loomed behind him, a monolith of darkness, hiding secrets he couldn't yet uncover. He couldn't shake the feeling that Kane's fall wasn't the end. Men like him didn't just disappear, not without leaving a trail. Sliding into the driver's seat, Ray rested his head against the steering wheel for a moment. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by exhaustion and a dull ache in his shoulder. But his mind refused to rest, replaying the events of the night in relentless loops. Kane's words echoed in his ears, taunting and cryptic. This isn't about escaping. It's about showing you how powerless you are. What had he meant? Was it just the rambling of an arrogant criminal? Or was there a deeper message? A warning? As Ray started the engine, his phone buzzed on the passenger seat. He picked it up, the screen glowing with a notification. An email, anonymous sender. The subject line read, "Nice try, detective." Ray's stomach dropped. His thumb hesitated before opening the message. Inside was a single attachment, a photo. It showed the interior of the precinct, taken from the perspective of someone standing in the hallway. His hallway. The timestamp was from an hour ago, while Ray had been at the warehouse. Kane had been inside. Ray's grip tightened on the phone as a cold realization washed over him. The warehouse wasn't a trap to kill him. It was a distraction. Kane had used the chase to buy himself time. But time for what? Ray's heart raced as he dialed the precinct, his hands trembling. The line rang once, twice, before a voice answered. Foster? It was the officer who'd stayed behind earlier. Check everything, files, evidence, systems. Ray barked, his voice sharp with urgency. See if anything's missing or compromised. Kane was there. There was a pause, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. Ray listened, the rain outside blurring into white noise. Finally, the officer returned. Detective, you need to see this, she said, her voice shaking. What is it? Ray demanded, already dreading the answer. Kane didn't just break in, she said. He wiped our case files. All of them. Ray's blood ran cold. Every lead, every piece of evidence they had on Kane gone. His entire team's months of work erased in an instant. Kane had outplayed them again. But this wasn't just about erasing his trail. This was personal. Ray slammed the phone down onto the seat beside him, his jaw clenched in frustration. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun, and Kane was pulling the strings. As Ray stared into the stormy night, a single thought burned in his mind. Whatever Kane was planning, he would stop him, no matter the cost. Ray gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. The rain outside blurred the city lights into a kaleidoscope of chaos. His mind raced, connecting fragments of the puzzle Kane had scattered. Kane wasn't just a criminal. He was a tactician. Every move, every word, every action was part of a larger scheme. And Ray had fallen right into it. The precinct wasn't just a target. It was a message. Kane wanted Ray to know how vulnerable they were, how easily he could dismantle them. But why? What was his endgame? Ray's phone buzzed again, snapping him from his thoughts. Another email. This time, the subject line read, "TikTok." Ray hesitated before opening it, his stomach twisting in dread. The email contained a video. He tapped play, and the screen filled with static before clearing. It was a live feed. The camera panned slowly over a dark room, dimly lit by a flickering bulb. In the center of the frame was a table, and on it sat a single item, a digital timer. It was counting down. 4 hours. Ray's heart pounded as the camera tilted upward, revealing a piece of paper taped to the wall. Scrawled in bold, black letters were the words, "Catch me before it's too late." And beneath it a name, not Kane's. A name Ray recognized instantly. A local politician known for his anti-crime initiatives. The man was outspoken, ruthless in his pursuit of justice. If Kane had targeted him, it wasn't random. This was personal. Ray slammed the car into gear, speeding toward the precinct. The rain blurred his vision, but his focus was razor-sharp. Kane wasn't just playing games anymore. This was war. Back at the precinct, the team was in chaos. Officers crowded around monitors, trying to trace the email's origin. "Anything?" Ray demanded as he stormed in, his wet coat dripping onto the floor. One of the techs shook her head, frustration etched across her face. "The IP address is bouncing all over the place. He's using layers of encryption. He's practically a ghost." Ray's fists clenched. "Then we need to think like him," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "He wants us to panic, to chase our tails while he stays 10 steps ahead. But there's always a clue." He turned back to the video, playing it again, this time with a sharper eye. The timer. The flickering bulb. The faint sound of dripping water in the background. And then, a flash, barely noticeable, but unmistakable. In the corner of the video frame, for just a split second, a logo appeared. A rusted, circular emblem painted on the wall behind the timer. Ray froze the frame, zooming in on the symbol. It was faded, but the outline was clear. A shipping company insignia. He'd seen it before, during a raid years ago on an abandoned harbor facility. "Kane's using the old docks," Ray muttered, his voice barely audible. The team gathered around him, eyes locked on the screen. "That place was shut down a decade ago," an officer said. "Perfect for someone who doesn't want to be found," Ray replied, grabbing his jacket. "Give me a tactical unit. We're moving now." As the team scrambled, Ray's mind raced. Kane had chosen the docks for a reason. Not just for its isolation, but for the symbolism. The last time Ray had been there, it had ended with a shootout, a fire, and a long list of casualties. Kane was dragging him back to his worst failures. And Ray wasn't about to let history repeat itself. The drive to the docks was tense, the convoy slicing through the storm. Ray's radio crackled with updates, but his focus was on the road ahead. The closer they got, the tighter the knot in his chest grew. The docks loomed in the distance, their skeletal cranes jutting into the sky like ominous sentinels. The convoy stopped just shy of the entrance. Ray stepped out, his boots sinking into the muddy ground. The air was thick with the smell of salt water and rust. Teams 1 and 2 flanked the east and west sides. Ray ordered, his voice calm but firm. "Keep your radios live. We move in silent and coordinated." The officers nodded, their faces grim with determination. Ray led his team through the main gate, his flashlight cutting through the dense fog. Every sound was amplified. The creak of metal, the drip of water, the distant hum of machinery still powered by a forgotten grid. The warehouse in the video came into view, its broken windows glowing faintly from within. Ray raised his hand, signaling the team to halt. "Kane's inside," he whispered into his radio. "Hold positions until I give the go." The team fanned out, taking cover behind crates and rusted vehicles. Ray approached the entrance, his weapon drawn. The door was slightly ajar, swaying in the wind. He pushed it open slowly, stepping into the cavernous space. The faint ticking of the timer echoed through the building. Ray's flashlight found it immediately, sitting on the table in the center of the room, just as it had been in the video. But the room was empty. No sign of Kane. Ray's pulse quickened. Something wasn't right. He approached the timer cautiously, his eyes scanning every shadow. The countdown had less than an hour left. A faint rustling sound came from above. Ray froze, his weapon snapping upward. "Kane," he shouted, his voice echoing through the warehouse. A laugh answered him, cold and mocking. "You're predictable, detective," Kane's voice called out from the rafters. Ray's flashlight caught movement, a silhouette darting between beams. "You think this is about saving the day? About being the hero?" Kane continued, his voice bouncing off the walls. "You've already lost." Ray's jaw tightened. He ignored the taunts, focusing on pinpointing the sound. "You don't scare me, Kane," Ray replied, keeping his tone steady. "You're just a man hiding behind tricks and shadows." Another laugh, closer this time. "Maybe, but you'll never catch me." Suddenly, the ticking grew louder, amplified through hidden speakers. And then Ray saw it. A second timer, strapped to the wall behind a stack of barrels marked with a hazardous materials symbol. His stomach dropped. "Explosives." "Kane, this isn't a game," Ray shouted, his voice laced with urgency. "Oh, but it is," Kane replied, his silhouette appearing on the catwalk above. "And the best part? You're running out of time." Ray's heart thundered as he realized the full scope of Kane's plan. This wasn't just a game, it was a spectacle. Kane wanted destruction, chaos, and to show just how powerless Ray truly was. Ray radioed his team, his voice sharp and urgent. "Evacuate now. The building is rigged with explosives." A flurry of responses crackled through the radio as officers began retreating. But Ray didn't move. He couldn't. Not while Kane was still here. He trained his weapon on the catwalk, his flashlight catching the glint of Kane's mocking grin. "Running out of time, detective," Kane called down, casually leaning against a rusted beam. Tick-tock. Ray stepped forward, his voice steady despite the storm of fear inside him. "You think this will prove something, Kane? Killing innocent people won't make you invincible." Kane tilted his head, feigning curiosity. "Innocent," he sneered. "Do you even hear yourself? The system you protect is a joke, a cage for people like me. You don't stop crime. You just push it into shadows." Ray's grip tightened on his weapon. "Then why not face me directly? If you think you're so untouchable, why hide behind bombs and theatrics?" Kane's smile faltered, just for a moment. Ray seized the opening, stepping closer. "You're afraid, Kane. Afraid that without your tricks, you're just another man running from the consequences of his choices." Kane's eyes narrowed, his mask of control slipping. "You don't know anything about me," he snapped, his voice cutting like a knife. Ray leveled his gun at Kane. "I know enough. I know you can end this. Right here. Right now." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the relentless ticking of the timer. Then Kane laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent chills down Ray's spine. "You think I care about ending this?" Kane said, stepping back toward the shadows. "I've already won." Ray's flashlight caught a flash of movement. Kane pulling a small device from his pocket. "A detonator." "No!" Ray shouted, firing a shot. The bullet hit the railing inches from Kane's hand, but it wasn't enough. Kane pressed the button. The timers beeped in unison, their pace quickening. Ray's heart sank as the realization hit him. Kane wasn't bluffing. A deafening roar filled the warehouse as the first explosion tore through the far wall. The shockwave knocked Ray off his feet, sending him crashing into a stack of crates. The world spun as flames erupted, engulfing the room in chaos. Through the haze, Ray saw Kane leap from the catwalk, disappearing into the inferno. Ray forced himself to his feet, his ears ringing, his body screaming in pain. He stumbled toward the exit, dodging falling debris and the searing heat. The warehouse groaned as its structure buckled, threatening to collapse. With a final burst of strength, Ray threw himself through the doorway, just as the second explosion detonated. The blast hurled him into the mud outside, the force knocking the air from his lungs. For a moment, everything was still. The rain poured down, smothering the flames as smoke billowed into the night sky. Ray coughed, his body aching, but his mind sharp. He scanned the wreckage, searching for any sign of Kane. But there was nothing. No movement, no silhouette, no mocking voice. Just silence. As his team rushed to his side, Ray couldn't shake the feeling gnawing at his chest. This wasn't over. Kane was faster than the police, always one step ahead. And tonight was just another move in a much larger game. Ray stared into the smoldering ruins, his jaw set with determination. "I'll find you," he muttered under his breath. "No matter how fast you run." Ray's hands trembled as he stood, watching the last embers flicker in the remains of the warehouse. The rain had softened, but the tension in the air remained thick. The team swarmed the wreckage, securing the perimeter, but Ray's mind was elsewhere, lost in the puzzle that Kane had left behind. Every step Kane had taken, every taunt, every trick, it was all a carefully laid trap, and Ray had been the bait. But Kane had underestimated one thing. Ray wasn't the type to quit, not when there were lives at stake. Ray's phone buzzed again, snapping him from his thoughts. He picked it up without hesitation. A single line of text flashed on the screen. "I told you you'd lose, detective, but you can still win." His pulse quickened. The message came with an attachment. Ray opened it without a second thought. It was a map, hand-drawn, with red circles marking several locations across the city. The largest one was an abandoned mansion on the outskirts. Ray's mind raced. Kim was planning something bigger, something even more destructive. Ray's grip tightened on the phone. He turned to his team, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "Prepare to move. Kane's not done. He set up another play, and we need to stop it before it's too late." The mansion loomed in the distance, its silhouette jagged against the dark sky. As the convoy approached, Ray felt the familiar tension knotting in his stomach. Each location on the map had brought them closer to this moment. But this place, this mansion, felt different. It was isolated, surrounded by overgrown trees and a thick fog that seemed to swallow everything whole. Ray signaled for the team to halt. "We move in fast, no mistakes," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The officers nodded, weapons drawn, and Ray led the way, his senses heightened. Every step felt like a countdown to the unknown. As they approached the front door, it creaked open on its own, as if anticipating their arrival. Ray froze for a split second. Then, without a word, he stepped inside. The air was thick, musty, and smelled of decay. The mansion had been abandoned for years, its grandeur lost to time and neglect. Ray's flashlight swept across the walls, revealing faded portraits and cracked mirrors. In the center of the room, a large, ornate chandelier hung precariously, casting eerie shadows across the floor. And then there it was, a loud click, followed by the hum of machinery coming to life. Ray's heart skipped a beat. He turned sharply, scanning the room for the source of the sound. From the corner of his eye, he spotted a blinking red light on the wall, a timer. Not one, but several, all synchronized, each one attached to a different device scattered throughout the room. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Kane wasn't just here. He had rigged the entire mansion. Ray's voice cracked through the tension. "Evacuate. Now!" But it was too late. A deafening explosion tore through the air, shaking the walls and sending debris flying in every direction. Ray was thrown backwards, slamming into the floor. His head rang with the force of the blast, and his vision blurred. Through the smoke and chaos, he saw shadows moving, figures darting in and out of the wreckage. Kane was here, and this time, there would be no escape. Ray's fingers clenched around his gun as he rose to his feet. He had to end this. This was the final chapter. Kane's game was coming to a close, and Ray was determined to be the one to write the ending. Ray's breath came in shallow gasps as he staggered to his feet, the ringing in his ears slowly fading. The smoke from the explosion still swirled around him, thick and suffocating. His eyes scanned the room, the shadows moving unervingly fast. There were figures, but none of them were Kane. Ray's mind raced. Where was he? He had to be close. The mansion was crumbling, but Ray didn't care about the walls or the wreckage. He had one goal: to catch Kane, to stop him for good. A sudden movement caught his attention, and his hand instinctively reached for his gun. A figure emerged from the smoke, but it wasn't Kane. It was one of the officers, bloodied and bruised, limping toward him. "Detective," the officer gasped, barely able to stand. "Kane's gone. We lost him." Ray's pulse quickened as he scanned the room again. No, this couldn't be the end. There had to be more. "I won't stop," Ray muttered under his breath. The officer looked at him, fear in his eyes. He's too fast, Ray. We're too slow. Ray shook his head, not willing to accept defeat. You don't understand, he said, his voice firm. Kane's playing a long game, and we've been following the wrong trail. He's not running away. He's leading us somewhere. The officer stared at him, confusion clouding his face. Ray wiped the sweat from his brow, his mind piecing together the puzzle. The map, the symbols, the locations, all of it had been carefully planned. But why? What was Kane's true objective? Ray's phone buzzed again, breaking his thoughts. He snatched it up quickly. A new message, and this time it wasn't from Kane. It was from someone Ray never expected to hear from. You're not the only one looking for him. The message contained another location, an old underground facility, far from the city. Ray's heart skipped. Could it be? Was someone else hunting Kane? Or was this another trap? Get the team together, Ray ordered, his voice sharp. We're not done yet. Kane's out there, and I won't stop until we bring him in. The drive to the underground facility was the longest of Ray's life. The streets blurred in a haze of rain and fog, but his mind was clear. This was it, the final confrontation. As the facility came into view, Ray's heart pounded harder. The structure was decaying, the windows shattered, and the gates hanging loosely on their hinges. Kane had left one last clue, and now Ray had to find him before it was too late. Ray led the team into the facility, weapons raised, every sense on high alert. The further they went inside, the darker it became. Every step echoed in the hollow building, a constant reminder of how deep they were going into Kane's lair. Ray's flashlight flicked across the walls, revealing old machinery, cables hanging loosely, and old surveillance equipment. But there was no sign of Kane, just silence. Then Ray noticed something strange, a faint glow in the distance, flickering like a heartbeat. He signaled for the team to move forward, his every instinct telling him this was where the endgame was. As they approached, the glow grew brighter. It was a massive monitor, surrounded by old equipment, with a single red button in the center. Ray's eyes locked onto the screen. There was a live feed of the city, of the precinct, of the politicians' offices. Everything was connected. Ray stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat. Then the screen shifted, showing a countdown. 15 minutes. This was it. Kane had planned one final move. Ray rushed to the monitor, but before he could make sense of it all, a voice came from behind him. Well, detective. Looks like you finally figured it out. Ray spun around, his heart freezing in his chest. There, standing in the doorway, was Kane, unscathed, smiling, and holding a detonator. Ray raised his weapon, but Kane was faster. He pressed the button. The countdown started, and everything changed. The sound of the countdown was deafening, drowning out everything else around Ray. 10 seconds. Ray's heart pounded in his chest, each beat like the ticking of a clock, echoing in the cavernous room. Kane's smile widened, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous kind of satisfaction. Do you feel it, detective? Kane taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. Your time is running out. Just like the others. Ray's fingers tightened around the grip of his gun, but he didn't take the shot. He couldn't. Not while the detonator was in Kane's hand. 8 seconds. Ray's mind raced. Every possible outcome flashed before him, each one worse than the last. There had to be a way to stop this. Kane, you don't have to do this, Ray said, his voice steady despite the tension rising within him. Kane laughed, the sound hollow and cold. I've already made my choice, detective. The system is broken, and I'm the one to fix it. Ray took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the detonator. You're wrong, Kane. This isn't fixing anything. It's just destroying lives. And that's not the answer. Kane's grip on the detonator tightened, but something flickered in his eyes, something that Ray hadn't seen before. Uncertainty. For just a moment, Kane's confidence wavered, and Ray seized the chance. 5 seconds. He moved quickly, taking a calculated risk. In one swift motion, Ray lunged forward, knocking Kane's hand away just as the button was about to be pressed. The detonator flew from his grasp, tumbling across the floor. Kane's eyes went wide with shock, but Ray didn't give him a chance to react. He tackled him to the ground, his body pinning Kane down. The countdown continued to tick, but now it was just background noise to Ray's determination. He reached for the detonator, grabbing it just as the timer hit 3 seconds. With a twist of his wrist, he disabled it. The room fell silent. The bomb had been defused. Ray stood up, breathing heavily, his hands shaking with the adrenaline rush. Kane lay on the ground, staring up at him, his face a mask of frustration and defeat. "You lost, Kane," Ray said, his voice calm, but with an edge of finality. "You're done." Kane didn't respond. He just stared at Ray, his expression unreadable. The authorities arrived moments later, securing the facility and taking Kane into custody. Ray stood outside, watching as they loaded Kane into the back of a police van. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of relief. The city was safe for now. But deep down, Ray knew this wasn't the end. Kane might have been caught, but there were others like him, and Ray would be ready for them. As the van disappeared into the distance, Ray looked out over the dark city. The night was quiet, but the war was far from over, and he would be waiting. Ray stood there, the weight of the night's events pressing down on him. The city, bathed in the eerie glow of streetlights, felt deceptively calm. But Ray knew better. Even though Kane was in custody, there was an unsettling feeling gnawing at him. This wasn't just about one man, it was about something much larger, something systemic. He couldn't shake the thought that Kane had been a mere pawn in a bigger game. He ran a hand over his face, exhaustion catching up with him. "Ray!" He turned to see his partner, Officer Daniels, approaching, her expression somber. "It's over, right?" she asked, her voice tinged with doubt. Ray looked back toward the van. "For now," he said, his tone heavy, but the doubt in Daniels' eyes mirrored his own. "Do you think we've seen the last of him?" she asked. Ray shook his head slowly, his gaze fixed on the city skyline. "No," he muttered. "Kane's just the beginning. There are always others, pulling strings behind the scenes." Daniel sighed, glancing down at her feet for a moment before meeting Ray's eyes again. "Are you going after them?" Ray didn't answer right away. He didn't have to. She knew him too well. Finally, he gave a single nod. "There's always more to the story, and I'm not walking away until I find it." The weight of his words hung in the air between them. It was the same determination that had driven him this far, through every case, every setback. And it would be the same determination that would keep him chasing the truth, no matter how dark it got. As the sound of the van's engines faded, Ray turned back toward the facility one last time. Somewhere in the shadows, something else was waiting. Something far more dangerous than he could ever have imagined. But Ray was ready. The chase wasn't over. It had only just begun. Ray's gaze lingered on the facility one last time, his instincts telling him there was still something hidden in those crumbling walls. The night felt colder now, as if the air itself had turned against him. He could feel the weight of the unknown pressing in, but he wasn't afraid. He had been through too much, seen too much to turn back now. Turning to Daniels, he met her eyes, a silent, understanding passing between them. "Let's go," Ray said, his voice calm but firm. They walked in silence, the city's distant hum a constant reminder that the world outside continued on, unaware of the storm that had just passed through. But Ray knew better. He knew that the calm before the storm was always the most dangerous. The next few days passed in a blur. Ray and his team worked tirelessly, following every lead, examining every clue Kane had left behind. But nothing led them to answers. Instead, the deeper they dug, the more they uncovered a tangled web of corruption that stretched far beyond anything they had imagined. Kane had been a part of something bigger, an underground network of criminals, hackers, and power brokers who operated in the shadows. And they were still out there. Ray could feel the walls closing in on him. Everywhere he turned, there were new threats, new dangers, and the constant feeling that they were always a step behind. But Ray wouldn't stop. He couldn't. The truth was out there, and he would find it, no matter what it took. One evening, Ray found himself alone in his office, sifting through files and reports, trying to piece together the fragmented puzzle that Kane had left behind. He didn't notice the time passing. It was only when his phone buzzed that he snapped back to reality. A new message. This time, there was no name, just a single sentence. You're closer than you think. Ray's heart skipped a beat. It was a message from Kane. Or was it someone else? He didn't know, but the words sent a chill down his spine. Whoever had sent it knew too much. And they were watching him. Ray grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. It was time to make another move. The city felt different as Ray drove through the darkened streets. The usual hustle and bustle had given way to an eerie quiet. Every corner seemed to hold a secret, and Ray was determined to uncover it. He arrived at the location, an old, abandoned building on the edge of town. It was familiar. He'd been here before, during the early days of the investigation, when the first whispers of Kane's operations had surfaced. Ray approached the entrance cautiously, his senses on high alert. The building was silent. Too silent. As he stepped inside, the air grew colder, and a strange feeling of unease settled over him. He wasn't alone. The faintest sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the building. Ray's pulse quickened. He wasn't sure who, or what, was waiting for him in the shadows, but he was ready. He had to be. With each step he took, the tension built. The building seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness swallowing up the light. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence. "Did you really think you could stop us, detective?" Ray froze, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. The voice came from the shadows, low and mocking. "You're not just fighting Kane anymore, Ray. You're fighting the system itself." And with that, the room exploded into chaos. Ray's heart hammered in his chest as the voice echoed through the darkness. Every muscle in his body screamed for action, but his mind stayed sharp, calculating. Whoever was behind this wasn't just another criminal. They were part of something far more dangerous. The sound of footsteps grew louder, reverberating off the cold, concrete walls. Ray's eyes flicked toward every corner, every shadow, but nothing appeared. And then, in an instant, everything exploded into motion. Figures rushed from the dark corners of the room, weapons drawn. Ray barely had time to react, dodging one attacker's strike while firing at another. But this wasn't just a simple fight. This was a battle against something much bigger than any one person. Ray's pulse surged as he fought back, each move calculated, his instincts guiding him through the chaos. He was fast, but they were faster. He could feel the weight of their knowledge, their power, pressing down on him, but he refused to relent. He couldn't afford to. For what felt like hours, the fight raged on. Each move felt like it could be his last. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. Ray stood in the center of the room, panting, his gun still aimed at the remaining attackers, but they had surrendered. Their faces were masked, but their eyes betrayed the fear they felt. Ray lowered his weapon slowly, his gaze locked on them. "What is this?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with disbelief. One of them spoke, his voice low. "You think you can stop this? This isn't just Kane. This is a revolution, a new order. And you, Detective Ray, you're just one of the few who can see it." Ray's mind spun as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Kane had been the catalyst, the spark. But this group, this underground network, was far more organized than anything he had imagined. For a moment, Ray considered the possibility. What if this was bigger than the law? Bigger than justice? But no. Ray clenched his fists, his jaw set with resolve. No. This ends now. With a final, decisive move, Ray called in backup. The authorities arrived moments later, taking the attackers into custody. Ray stood alone in the aftermath, his breath slow and steady, the weight of the moment sinking in. He had stopped them for now, but Ray knew the battle wasn't over. The war against the unseen, the system that operated in the shadows, was far from done. He couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future. And for as long as it took, Ray would keep fighting. He would stand guard against the darkness, waiting for the day the truth would finally come to light.